She was standing at the window when she said it. Not looking at me. Looking at the bridge, or the river under it, or maybe just the dark between the two streetlights that had been arguing with each other all winter. One flickering. One steady. Neither one winning. She had a glass of water in her right hand, and she hadn't touched it in 20 minutes. I knew because I'd been watching the ice melt. That's the kind of man I'd become by then, the kind who tracks ice melt instead of asking the question sitting right there in the room with us. "I think I have to leave," she said. Not angry. Not dramatic. The way you say something you've been rehearsing alone for a while. Testing the weight of it. Deciding if you can carry it out loud. I didn't say don't. That's what I keep coming back to. I didn't say don't. And I knew even as I was not saying it, that the not saying was its own kind of answer. I just stood there in my kitchen doorway with a dish towel over my shoulder, and I looked at the back of her head and I thought, when did this happen? Not as a question. More like reading the thermostat on a system you've been ignoring and finally understanding why every room in the house felt wrong. Let me back up. My name is Daniel Marsh. I am 38 years old. I have been an HVAC technician for 14 years. Which means I spend most of my working hours inside other people's walls, behind their ceilings, underneath their floors, diagnosing the systems that keep them comfortable without them ever having to think about it. I am good at this. Not brilliant. Not legendary. Just good in the way that reliable things are good consistently, without drama, without ever needing to be noticed. I find the problem. I fix the problem. I restore the temperature to where it should be. And then I leave. The house breathes again. Nobody sends a thank you card to their ductwork. I live in Pittsburgh. Second floor of a duplex on Brereton Street, 3 blocks from the 40th Street Bridge. Close enough that on quiet nights I can hear the cables hum when the wind comes off the Allegheny at the right angle. It's not a romantic sound. It's more like the building clearing its throat. I've lived here for 6 years. The last 2 of them alone, in the particular silence that follows the end of a marriage that didn't end badly, which is somehow worse than if it had. Her name was Caroline, my ex-wife. We were together for 9 years and then we weren't, and when we sat across from each other in the mediator's office, there was nothing to fight about. That was the whole problem. We had become 2 people who agreed on everything and felt nothing, and had built a very clean, very organized life together that neither one of us actually wanted to be inside anymore. We split the furniture with the same cheerless efficiency we'd split dinner checks for years. I took the kitchen table, the good lamp, and a box of tools that had been mine before we met. She took the couch, the art we'd bought in Asheville, and the dog we'd adopted thinking it might help. It didn't help. It just gave us something else to divide. After the divorce, I recalibrated. That's the only word that makes sense to me for what I did. I adjusted the settings. I lowered the temperature to something manageable, increased the airflow just enough to keep things from going stagnant, and I sealed off the rooms that weren't being used. I was good at that. I spent my whole career sealing off rooms that weren't being used. The apartment on Brereton felt appropriately sized for one person who had decided, not bitterly but firmly, that the variable of another person was simply too difficult to account for in the system. The bedroom down the hall changed all that. Not the room itself, a 10 by 12 rectangle with a closet that stuck and a window that faced the back alley, but the fact of it, empty rooms have a particular quality in the winter in Pittsburgh. They pull heat, no matter how well insulated the wall between them is. An unoccupied room will eventually cool to something that bleeds through, and you feel it in the hallway. A slight drop. A reminder. I told myself I was renting it out for practical reasons. The mortgage made more sense split 2 ways. That was true, but it was also true that by October of last year, the silence in the apartment had developed a texture I didn't like, and no amount of recalibration was fixing it. I put the listing up on a Tuesday. By Thursday I had 11 inquiries. I responded to 6 of them. Met 3 people in person. and was about to offer it to a graduate student named Marcus who seemed clean and quiet and forgettable in all the right ways, when Nora Vásquez sent me a message that was 4 sentences long and ended with a request I had never received from a prospective tenant. The first 3 sentences were normal. She was 34. She worked from home as a medical interpreter. She was looking for something month to month while she sorted out a longer-term situation. Standard. Then the 4th sentence. I have one request before I'd consider signing anything. I need to know there will always be a doorstop available for my bedroom door. Not for any strange reason. I just need to know I can keep the door open if I want. I read it twice. I almost didn't respond. Not because the request was alarming, it wasn't, but because it was so specific, and specificity in a prospective tenant usually means something more is coming. What I didn't do was ask what the request was really about. I told myself it was none of my business, which was technically true, and also, I realize now, a way of keeping the interaction at the temperature I preferred. I found a rubber doorstop in my utility drawer, the kind with the little metal bracket, painted red, worn at the wide end from years of use. I left it outside her door before she moved in, and I never mentioned it. She moved in on a Saturday in early November. In the rain. She had a rolling suitcase, a tote bag, a cardboard box of books, and a second box she carried herself and set in her closet before she unpacked anything else. I helped her with the suitcase. We didn't talk much. I showed her how the bathroom faucet ran cold for 45 seconds before it warmed up, where I kept the extra towels. The trick with the stove's front left burner that required you to hold the knob a half-second longer than felt natural. She listened carefully. She had the quality of someone who has moved enough times to know that landlord instructions are the difference between a manageable inconvenience and a miserable month. Before she went to bed that first night, I heard her door open, and then a soft scrape on the hardwood, the doorstop being wedged into place. I was in the kitchen. I didn't say anything. I turned the heat up 2 degrees because the rain had made the evening colder than the forecast, and she had come from the Bay Area and probably didn't own the right coat yet. I told myself it was just good property management. Keep the tenant comfortable. Keep the system running smoothly. Keep everything at the correct temperature and let the house breathe. I had rules. I want to be clear that they made sense at the time. Rule 1, don't learn her schedule. She was a tenant, not a roommate. And the distinction felt important. A tenant pays rent and occupies space. A roommate becomes a variable in your daily calculations. And I had spent 2 years getting my daily calculations down to something I could sustain. So I told myself I would not pay attention to when she woke up, or when she slept, or what her rhythms were. I lasted 9 days before I broke this one, and I didn't even notice I'd broken it. I just found myself adjusting the thermostat at 6:45 each morning because the apartment was cold at 6:45 and she was usually in the kitchen by 7, and I didn't think about why I knew that. It wasn't attraction. It was the same reflex that makes you check the pressure gauge before you know there's a problem, the system telling you something before you're ready to hear it. Rule 2, don't cook together. The kitchen was a shared space, but cooking was intimate in a way that felt dangerous. Or not dangerous exactly, but porous. Cooking together let someone see how you moved in a space, how you thought, what shortcuts you took. I'd cooked with Caroline for 9 years, and I knew exactly what it had done to the walls between us, and I was not building new walls just to lose them again. This rule broke on a Wednesday in mid-November when she asked if she could use the stove while I was heating soup on the back burner. And I said yes without thinking, because saying no would have required explaining the rule, which would have required acknowledging the rule existed, which would have required admitting there was something to guard against. We made our separate things in companionable silence and then ate at opposite ends of the kitchen table, and that was fine. That was containable. What I didn't account for was that she hummed while she cooked. Not a song. Just a low, absent sound. The kind you make when you're not performing for anyone. I didn't say anything. I just cataloged it and told myself I wasn't cataloging it. Rule 3, don't ask personal questions. This one I held longer than the others, because it was the one I believed in most. She had her reasons for the doorstop, for the month-to-month, for landing in Pittsburgh in November with 2 boxes and a story she hadn't volunteered. Those were her systems to manage. I had no business putting my hands in them. A good technician doesn't open equipment that isn't malfunctioning. You assess, you observe, you intervene only when invited. So I didn't ask about the Bay Area. I didn't ask about the longer-term situation she was sorting out. And I especially didn't ask about the request that had started all of this. But the doorstop kept moving. That was the thing I couldn't stop noticing, even though I told myself I wasn't noticing. Some mornings it was wedged under her door. Some mornings it was sitting against the baseboard in the hallway. Some mornings it was inside her room, just visible through the open door, sitting near the closet like a small red animal that had wandered in and wasn't sure it belonged. I understood eventually, not consciously, but the way you understand something about a system before you can name it, that the position of the doorstop was telling me something about how she'd slept. Open door. Doorstop firmly wedged. She'd slept well enough. Door closed. Doorstop in the hall. She'd had a hard night and needed the room to herself in the morning. I wasn't reading her. Exactly. I was just reading the evidence the way I read gauges and pressure charts and the particular sound a compressor makes when it's working too hard. The data was there. I wasn't looking for it. I just had eyes. Rule 3 broke in December. On a Thursday morning when I came out of my room at 7 and found the doorstop sitting in the middle of the hallway, not near her door or near mine, just in the center of the floor, which it had never been before. I picked it up. I stood there a moment. Then I set it on the small table by the front door, and I knocked lightly on her bedroom door, which was closed. She said, "Yeah, the way people say it when they're awake but haven't been for long." Doorstop was in the middle of the floor. I said, "Put it on the table by the door." A pause. "Okay, thanks." That was the entire conversation. I told myself it didn't count as a personal question because I hadn't actually asked anything. What I knew, though, and couldn't unknow, was that she had gotten up in the night and moved the doorstop herself, consciously, to the middle of the floor, and that something had happened in her room to make her do that. I didn't ask what, but I thought about it on the job all day, crouched behind a furnace in a house in Lawrenceville, running diagnostics on a heat exchanger that was cracked in a place the homeowner couldn't see. And I thought there are systems that look fine from the outside and are failing in places no standard inspection catches. And you only know because you know what to listen for. She had a request about her door because something had happened to her that made open doors feel necessary. That was the shape of it. I didn't need more than that. What I didn't realize was that knowing the shape of it was already more than I'd given myself permission to know. December in Pittsburgh is relentless in the specific way that cities built on rivers are relentless in winter, not just cold, but damp and gray in a way that gets into your joints and stays there. I run a space heater in the truck between jobs. I keep a spare pair of gloves in the tool bag because I lose gloves the way other people lose earbuds. Constantly. Mystifyingly. Always the left one first. I come home with the smell of ductwork in my jacket, which is a smell I can't describe to anyone who hasn't been in a lot of attics, dust and metal and something almost electrical, like the inside of an old radio. Nora was unfazed by the cold in a way I hadn't expected. She'd grown up in the Bay Area, which I knew, and I'd assumed she'd spend the winter complaining about the temperature the way people from California always do. She didn't. She bought a heavy coat in her second-week brown wool. Practical. Nothing stylish about it, and she walked everywhere in it without drama. I saw her once from the truck coming back from a job, walking up Penn Avenue in the sleet, head down but not hurried. And I thought, she is used to moving through things that are difficult without making a show of it. I didn't know where that thought came from. I also didn't mention that I'd seen her. The fourth rule broke later than the others and more quietly, and I'm not sure exactly when it happened, which is the worst kind of breaking, the kind you only identify in retrospect. The way you find the fault line after the crack has already traveled halfway across the wall. I think it was the rainy Thursday in mid-December. I'd gone back to the apartment mid-afternoon to pick up a part I'd left on the counter, a replacement capacitor for a job in Shadyside, and she wasn't there. Which was not unusual. She worked from home but sometimes went to a library or a coffee shop in the afternoon. I grabbed the part. I left. I came back at 6. Still not there. I ate dinner. 7 o'clock. 7:30. I told myself I wasn't tracking the time, which was its own kind of lie, because the only people who tell themselves they're not tracking the time are people who are tracking the time. At 8, I sent her a text. I said there was a minor drip in the bathroom faucet I'd noticed and just wanted her to know I'd fix it on the weekend. That was true, there was a drip. It was a minor drip I'd been meaning to address for 2 weeks and had not thought about even once until I needed a reason to text her. I waited for the reply with a kind of attention I hadn't applied to anything personal in 2 years. She replied at 8:22. She said thanks. No rush. She'd noticed it too. The relief I felt was not proportionate to the content of the message. I knew that even then. I put my phone down and I looked at the ceiling and I said, out loud to no one, Daniel, come on. But here's the thing about systems that are already in motion. You can acknowledge the problem and still not stop it. I've seen it 100 times in my work, the homeowner who knows the furnace is overdue for service but waits anyway. Because the heat still comes on. Because it hasn't failed yet. Because confronting the problem means admitting the system is more fragile than they'd let themselves believe. I knew exactly what was happening in my apartment in December. I just kept telling myself the heat was still coming on. The strange request. I have to talk about the strange request, because it sat at the center of everything in a way I only understood much later. Before she signed the lease, we met at the apartment for a walkthrough. She was quiet during the walkthrough, methodical, opening every cabinet and closet with the efficient curiosity of someone who'd rented enough places to know what questions to ask. When we got to the bedroom, she stood in the doorway for a moment without going in, just looked at it. The window, the closet, the radiator, the door itself and its hinges. It locks from the inside, she said, not a question. Yes, I said, and there's no way to lock it from the outside. Not without a key I don't have. She nodded. She went in and checked the window latch, the closet, the baseboard heater. Then she said, without turning around, I have one request. I know it sounds odd, and she told me about the doorstop. What I told myself at the time was that it wasn't my business. What I'm telling you now is that I understood it. Not the specific history, I didn't know that yet, but the logic. She needed to know the door could be open if she wanted it to be. She needed the option available. The rubber wedge sitting there like a small red promise that no one could trap her in a room she wasn't choosing to stay in. She was asking me, before she would agree to share a space with a man she didn't know, whether she could trust the space to let her leave. I said yes. I meant it. And I left the doorstop outside her door without being asked again. And I never, in all the months that followed, commented on where it was or wasn't or why. That was, I think, the first real thing I did for her. Before I knew I was doing things for her, she asked me in early January, on a night when the temperature had dropped to 8 degrees and the radiators in the apartment were working harder than I'd heard them work in years, knocking and hissing with the particular vocal quality of old iron pipes doing their best. What I liked about my job, we were both in the kitchen. She was making tea. I was reviewing the service schedule for the following week, paper spread on the table, which I still do the old way because I learned the job from a man who distrusted computers, and some of his habits are too deep in me now to pull out. She just asked it, lightly, with the ease of someone who asks questions for a living. I like that I can tell when something's wrong. I said, even when it looks fine on the surface. There are sounds, temperature gradients, pressure readings that are just slightly off what they should be. And if you learn to pay attention to those things, you can fix a problem before it becomes a failure. I paused. Most people wait until something breaks. If you're paying attention, you usually don't have to. She poured her tea and held the mug in both hands and said, "That sounds like a very useful way to move through the world." I didn't say anything to that, but I thought it's also a very lonely way to move through the world, because you spend your whole life noticing things that other people don't know they're not noticing, and you can't always explain to someone what you've found or what it means. She told me things in pieces, the way people do when they're used to being careful, not in confessions, not in long explanations, just in the occasional sentence that revealed more than it seemed to. Her work she interpreted between patients and doctors in 3 languages, Spanish and Portuguese and English, and she had been doing it for 8 years and found it both demanding and strangely clarifying. Because being the person in the room whose only job is to get meaning across exactly tends to make you very precise about what language can and cannot carry. Her people, a mother in Fresno, a younger brother she called once a week on Sundays, friends she referenced but didn't detail, her before she had been with someone for 6 years, and what she said about it was only this: "It took me a long time to understand that the problem wasn't me. When you finally figure that out, you have to start over from a weird place." I didn't ask for more, but I heard everything in that sentence that she meant me to hear, and some things she might not have. In January, she got a bad cold that kept her in bed for 4 days. I know this is not remarkable. People get colds, but she had not been sick since she moved in, and sick was different from everything I'd calibrated for. Sick meant I could hear her moving around at 2 in the morning, her footsteps slower than usual, the particular sound of the bathroom cabinet opening and closing. Sick meant she didn't work and the apartment was different in the middle of the day, present in a way it wasn't when she was elsewhere. Sick meant I stopped in the hall outside her room on the second day, listening, the way I'd listen outside a wall when I suspected something was wrong inside it, just checking that the sounds were right. I left soup outside her door. Not homemade, I bought it from the Slovak place on Penn that made it the right way, with thick noodles and real vegetables, the kind that actually tastes like someone made it for you. I knocked once and stepped back. She opened the door in a sweatshirt and her hair pushed back, and she looked at the soup and then at me and said, "You didn't have to do that. There's a good place 2 blocks over." I said, "I go there anyway." That was a lie. I had driven 12 minutes each way specifically for this soup. She probably knew that. She took it and said thank you in a quiet voice that had something in it I didn't want to examine too closely, and I went back to my room and sat on the edge of my bed and thought about pressure gradients for a while. She broke her own rule in February. That is the part of the story I keep coming back to, because her rule mattered in a way I hadn't understood until she broke it. No food on the counter, that was what she'd asked. Before she moved in, before she signed anything, just that one thing. And when I'd asked if there was a reason, she'd said, "Just a preference," in a way that told me it wasn't a preference. I'd said fine, and I'd never left anything on the counter. And I'd noticed that she never left anything on the counter either. Not even her mug. Not even a plate she was planning to wash in 2 minutes. Everything went away immediately. It was her rule and she enforced it completely. For both of us. Without ever having to say it again. On a Tuesday in the second week of February, I came home from a job in Mount Washington at close to 7 in the evening. Cold and tired in the specific way that cold tired accumulates after a day of crawling through spaces not designed for human occupation. The kind of tired where you've stopped caring about most things. I unlocked the door. I came in. I took my boots off, and I looked up. There was a plate on the counter, covered in foil, a small yellow post-it on top. I stood there looking at it for a long moment before I crossed the kitchen and read what the post-it said. It said, "There's enough." That was all. 2 words and a covered plate. I stood in that kitchen for a very long time. She had cooked. She had made something. I lifted the foil and found rice and a bean stew. Still warm. The kind of food that takes actual time and thought, and she had made enough for 2. and she had put mine on the counter, which she never put anything on, and she had written 2 words that were the most open thing she'd said to me in 3 months. Not, "I made extra." Not, "Thought you might be hungry." Just, "There's enough." As though enough was the thing she was telling me. As though she'd decided something. I sat down at the kitchen table with the plate and I ate it, and I didn't do anything else for a while. Outside, the cables on the 40th Street Bridge were humming in the February wind. The radiator knocked twice in the living room and then went quiet. I thought about systems that regulate themselves, the thermostats that don't need you to adjust them because they've already learned what the room needs. I'd always preferred the manual kind. I'd spent a lot of years believing that the safest approach was to keep my hand on the controls. Stay conscious of every setting. Run nothing on automatic. I'd thought that was precision. It might have been fear. I washed the plate. I dried it. I put it away in her cabinet. The next morning she was already in the kitchen when I came out, and there was a moment short, contained, one of those silences that has weight, and then she said, "How was it?" Not casual. Genuine. "Good," I said. "Really good." She nodded. She went back to her coffee. I made mine. We stood on opposite sides of the kitchen in the gray February light, and I thought, I've been in this apartment for 6 years and it has never felt this large and small at the same time. I called my friend Eddie that week. Eddie is my oldest friend in Pittsburgh, a plumber I met on a job 15 years ago. And he has the particular gift of listening to you talk around a thing for 20 minutes and then saying the exact thing you were trying not to say. I told him about the apartment, the tenant, the soup, the plate. I told him about the doorstop and the rule and the post-it, and he listened to all of it and then said, "You know what's funny? You just described being in love with someone without ever using the word. That's not what that was." I said, "Okay," he said. He did not sound convinced. He also did not argue, because Eddie understands that some things have to be arrived at in your own time. What I did instead of listening to Eddie was go to work. I had a full week of service calls in the middle of February, 2 commercial units in the Strip District, a residential heat pump in Squirrel Hill that had been misdiagnosed twice before I got there, and a building in East Liberty with a ventilation problem that turned out to be a bird's nest in a duct that nobody had checked in 3 years. I am good at my job. I am especially good at the problems other people have given up on. The ones where the diagnosis was wrong and the fix made things worse, and now everyone is frustrated and nobody can get comfortable. I find the actual source. I correct it. The system breathes again. I came home on Friday night of that week and sat in my truck outside the duplex for longer than I needed to and looked up at the lights on the 2nd floor. Her light was on in the kitchen. The small lamp in her room was on, which meant the door was open, which meant she'd slept well enough the night before or was feeling secure enough in the evening that the open door felt like a choice and not a need. I thought I have spent 14 years learning to read systems. I have gotten very good at knowing what a space needs before it fails. And I have spent the last 2 years applying all of that skill to keeping my own system airtight, sealed against variables, running at a temperature that doesn't hurt. I thought I was being precise. I think I was being cowardly. I went upstairs. She was in the kitchen, at the table, working, laptop open, headphones around her neck, papers she was marking in a precise, unhurried hand. She looked up when I came in and said, "There's coffee if you want it." I said, "I want to ask you something." She waited. Nothing shifted in her face. She was a person who knew how to wait. "The doorstop," I said. "The request. Before you moved in." "A beat." She set her pen down. "I'm not asking for the whole story," I said. "I don't need the whole story. I just want you to know that I understand what you were asking. Not the doorstop specifically. What you were actually asking." She was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then she said, "I know." "Okay," I said. "Okay," she said. That was the conversation. 6 sentence total. But something in the room changed pressure. I felt it the way I feel the moment a system restores, not loud, not dramatic, just a shift in the air, a return to the temperature it's supposed to be. And now we're back to the window. A Tuesday night. A glass of water. The bridge lights outside. The ice melting in the glass she hadn't touched. She said, "I think I have to leave." I didn't say don't. And then I said something else. I said, "Because of me." Or, "Because you're ready." She turned from the window. Not dramatically. Just turned. The way you turn when someone finally asks the right question. "I don't know," she said. "That's the problem." "Okay," I said. "I can't stay here because it's comfortable." She said, "I've done that. I stayed somewhere because it was comfortable, and I stopped asking if it was right, and one day I woke up and I was so far from where I should have been that I didn't know how to start." "I know," I said. "Not empty. I meant it. So I have to want to stay for a real reason." She said, "And I'm scared that what I have is just comfort. That I'm doing it again." I thought about what to say. I thought about systems and sensors, and the difference between a false reading and a true one. I thought about how a thermostat can register a temperature accurately and still not tell you whether the temperature is right. Comfort is data. I said, "It's not the whole answer, but it's not nothing. The question is whether there's something else underneath it. Because I think there is. I think you know there is." She looked at me for a long time. That's a very technical way to talk about your feelings. "I know. I'm working on it." Something moved in her face that wasn't quite a smile but was in the same direction. She looked down at the glass in her hand, looked at the water, and set it on the windowsill. She said, "I'm not leaving this week." "Okay," I said. "I'm not promising anything about next week." "That's fine. I need you to not be weird about this." "I will try," I said, with limited confidence in my own success. That one got the smile. Small, real, the kind that wasn't for an audience. She didn't leave that week, or the next. In March, the weather in Pittsburgh does one of its seasonal negotiations, trading gray for occasional pale blue, letting the temperature lift just enough to convince you that it might eventually become spring and then pulling it back again too. Days later, just to be clear about who's in charge. I have lived here long enough to not be fooled by March but to appreciate the gesture. The cold has a different quality in March. It's a cold that feels provisional rather than permanent. And provisional cold is something you can work with. I fixed the bathroom faucet. I replaced a washer in the kitchen sink that had been wearing down since October. I serviced the boiler in the basement and found that it had been running slightly above optimal pressure for at least 3 months. Not dangerously, but inefficiently, working harder than it needed to for the heat it was producing. I adjusted it. The radiators in the apartment stopped knocking as much after that. She noticed. She said, "It's quieter at night." And I said, "Yeah." I fixed the boiler. And she said, "I didn't even know that was something that needed fixing." And I said, "That's the point." And she looked at me the way she sometimes looked at me when she was deciding whether a thing I'd said was annoying or interesting. She told me more in March. Not everything. I don't think I know everything now. And I don't need to, but enough. The 6 years. The way it started being not enough air and she didn't know why and she told herself she was the problem. The move to Pittsburgh, which hadn't been entirely her choice and had then become entirely her survival. The shaking hands the day she came to see the apartment, which she had attributed to caffeine and which we both knew had not been caffeine. The doorstop, which had been the only way she could think to tell a stranger, "I need to be able to leave. I need you to understand that," without making it a whole thing. I told her things too. About Caroline. About the mediator's office. About the cleanliness of an ending that should have been ugly and wasn't, and why that was actually harder. About the silence in the apartment that winter. About adjusting the thermostat before she woke up and not knowing for 3 weeks that I was doing it. She listened the way she listened at work completely. Without filling space she didn't need to fill. You adjusted the thermostat. she said, before I was even awake. It's not romantic, I said. It was a practical response to a, Daniel. Yeah, it was a little romantic. I looked at the table. Maybe a little. Spring arrived properly in April, the way spring arrives in Pittsburgh abruptly, with something like apology, as if it's embarrassed by how long winter held on. The light changed first. Then the temperature. Then the smell of the air. The Allegheny ran high and gray-green with snowmelt from somewhere upstream. I had more work than I could schedule comfortably, which is how it always goes. The cold season ends, and everyone who put off the maintenance they should have done in October calls at once. I was on jobs 6 days a week through most of April. She was still there. The doorstop settled into a new position sometime in April. I noticed it one morning, really noticed it. Stopped and paid attention. It was wedged under her door, which was open, and had been in that position consistently for about 2 weeks. Not moved to the hallway. Not in the middle of the floor. Just steadily, daily, in the same place. Her door opened. The small red wedge doing its work. The room aired out and accessible and chosen. I picked it up one afternoon when she was on a call, just to look at it. Worn rubber. The metal bracket a little rusty at the screw. It had been in my utility drawer for years before any of this. I'd picked it up at a hardware store when I moved in. Some vague intention of keeping a closet door open. You never used it for that purpose. It had just sat there. And then it had become, without my intending it, the first real thing I gave her. The first yes to a question she'd been afraid to ask directly. I set it back down. I went to work. She was in the kitchen when I came back that evening. And I stood in the doorway and I said, I want you to stay. Not as a landlord. She knew that. She looked at me for a moment. She said, I know. Is that an answer? I said. It's a start, she said. She made tea. I sat at the kitchen table. The light was evening light, the kind that comes in low and gold through the window that faces west. And it did what light like that does in a kitchen, made everything look like it had been there a long time, like it belonged. The radiators were quiet. The cables on the bridge hummed distantly. She brought her mug to the table and sat across from me, and we talked for 2 hours about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. And it was not a declaration, and it was not a conclusion, and it was not the end of something or the beginning of something so much as it was the moment I understood what I'd been reading and all. The data, all the small signals, all the pressure gradients and temperature shifts that I'd been cataloging for months without letting myself name. The system wasn't closed anymore. I'd opened it. Or she had. Or we'd opened it together in the way that things happen when two people stop managing the distance between them and let the room breathe. Later, when she went to bed, I heard the soft scrape of the doorstop on the hardwood floor. But this time, for the first time, the sound came from her opening the door, not just leaving it available. Not just ensuring the escape route, but choosing, on a Tuesday night in April with the spring air coming in off the Allegheny, to let the room open out into the rest of the apartment, into the hallway, into whatever was on the other side. I turned off the kitchen light and went to my own room, and I lay there, listening to the spring settle into the building's bones. The old wood contracting and expanding with the temperature change. All the small adjustments a structure makes when the season shifts. The building, doing what buildings do, accommodating the new conditions. Finding the equilibrium. Breathing. I thought there are systems you manage and systems you trust. I've spent my whole career knowing the difference but only applying it to other people's houses. I think I'm learning to apply it to my own. But sleep didn't come right away that Tuesday night. It rarely does when something has shifted, not disrupted. Not broken, but shifted. The way a house settles differently after a foundation repair. You feel the new alignment before you can name it. The building is the same building. You are not quite the same person inside it. I lay there and I thought about the first time I walked through this apartment. 6 years ago. A different winter. And the landlord who'd owned the building for 30 years showed me every room with the particular pride of someone who has maintained a thing carefully and knows its worth. He pointed out the original hardwood, the plaster walls, the radiators that were cast iron and therefore indestructible if you treated them right. He said, "The heat's never failed in this building in 30 years. I believed him. I signed the lease. 2 years later I was living in it alone with the second bedroom closed off and the heat running at a temperature I'd set and never reconsidered. I had maintained it carefully. I had not, for a long time, lived in it. There is a difference. I know this professionally. The difference between a system that is maintained and a system that is inhabited. Maintained systems run correctly. Inhabited systems are warm. I had been very correct for a very long time. I thought about Caroline. I do this less than I used to, and when I do it now, it doesn't have the quality of old pain that it had in the first year after the divorce. It has more the quality of an old repair. You can see where the work was done. You know what was broken. You appreciate that it holds. I thought about why we had been so calm in the mediator's office. And I think what I understand now, that I didn't then, is that we were calm because we were both relieved. Not happy, relieved. The way a pressure gauge drops when you release the right valve. We had been two people maintaining something neither of us was living in. And finally, mercifully, we'd admitted it. The calm was the system decompressing. Not healing, depressurizing. I hadn't let anything run at pressure since. That was the calibration I'd made. Keep everything at maintenance level. Nothing inhabited. Correct but not warm. Nora was warm. Not in the soft focus sense. In the literal, physical sense, the apartment was warmer with her in it. In a way I couldn't entirely account for through thermostat readings. People generate heat. I know this. A body in a room changes the ambient temperature by a measurable number of degrees. But what I mean is something that the thermostat doesn't measure: the warmth of a kitchen where someone else is also making coffee. The warmth of a Sunday afternoon when you can hear someone in the next room. Not intrusively. Just there. Just breathing and existing, and occasionally making the low, absent humming sound that she made when she wasn't performing for anyone. I had not lived with warmth in 2 years. I'd forgotten what it did to a space. I fell asleep eventually, listening to the bridge. There was an evening in late April, a Friday, when she came home with a look on her face that I recognized immediately and could not have explained how I recognized it. I'd only been paying attention to her for 5 months. But 5 months of a certain kind of attention, the kind I applied to systems, the kind that notices deviation before it becomes failure, is enough to know a face's usual frequencies, and her frequency that Friday was off. She set her bag down. She sat at the kitchen table. She didn't reach for anything. She just sat. I was in the kitchen already, making pasta in the unceremonious way. I make pasta when I'm not thinking about it. Boiling water and opening a jar of sauce and not pretending any of it was more than it was. I looked at her and said, "Bad call." Medical interpreting has a specific kind of bad day that I'd come to understand in rough outline. The calls where the news is very bad, and she has to carry it across the language barrier without flinching. The calls where a patient is frightened and the fear gets into the words and she has to render it exactly, accurately, without absorbing it. She was supposed to render, not absorb, but she was human, and sometimes, she told me, the boundary between the two was thinner than the training said it should be. Pediatric oncology consult, she said. Family speaks Portuguese. 3 of them. Mom, Dad, and the grandmother. The grandmother didn't understand the scans and kept asking if they had the wrong child's scans, and I had to keep telling her. She stopped, put her hands flat on the table, looked at them. "Yeah," I said. "I'm fine," she said. "I just need a minute." I didn't say anything to that. I put a bowl of pasta in front of her. I sat across from her with my own bowl and I ate in silence, and she sat there for a while with her hands flat on the table, and then, without looking up, she started eating too. We didn't talk for most of the meal. That was fine. That was its own kind of enough. After, she said, "Thank you for not telling me it was okay." It wasn't okay. No, she said. It wasn't. The pasta was mediocre. Though, I said, which is actually okay. Mediocre pasta is a neutral fact of the universe. She looked at me. It was fine pasta. It was jarred sauce. I know. I don't care. Good, I said. That's the right attitude about jarred sauce. It was the first time she laughed that evening. Just a short one. But it changed the frequency in the room back toward something familiar, and I felt the pressure equalize. And I thought, this is what it looks like when you've let someone into the system. Not the dramatic version. Not the version where you throw open all the windows and let everything pour in. Just the version where there's someone in the kitchen on a Friday, and you can tell when they're off. And you know whether they need talking or silence or bad pasta. And you get it right. And the room breathes again. She did the dishes. I dried. We didn't discuss it. It was a practical division of labor that had developed over months with no explicit agreement. The way practical things develop between people who share a space and pay attention to each other organically. Without declaration. Just the slow accumulation of small adjustments that eventually constitute a way of living. I thought this is how it happens. Not in the moment of recognizing it. Much earlier. In all the adjustments. My mother called in early May to ask, as she calls every 2 or 3 months to ask, whether I was seeing anyone. My mother is not a pushy woman in most respects. She is practical. Economical with words. A retired postal worker from just south of here, who has always viewed the world through the lens of whether things function correctly. But on the subject of my personal life, she develops a persistence that she applies to nothing else, checking it the way she checks the expiration dates on things in her pantry, not expecting anything to be wrong, but wanting to be sure. I said, "There's someone," not planning to say it, just saying it. "Someone," she said, in the specific tone she uses when she's gathering information and doesn't want to spook it. She rents the second bedroom. I stopped, tried to account for what it was accurately. It's something. Is she good to you? I thought about that. Not whether she was kind, which she was, whether she was good to me specifically, which is a more precise question and deserves a precise answer. Whether the particular thing she offered, the steadiness, the careful language. The Friday evening when she let me give her bad pasta and silence without needing it to be more was something she offered to me. Consciously. With the full knowledge of who I was. Yeah, I said, she is. My mother said, good, and moved on to asking whether I'd had the truck serviced, which I had, and whether I was eating real food, which I largely was thanks to Nora, though I didn't say that part. After I hung up, I sat with the fact of having said it to someone outside the apartment. There's someone. That's the step that changes things from private to real. Not because it requires external validation, it didn't. It was already real, but because saying it out loud to your mother on a Sunday afternoon in May is its own kind of acknowledging that the system you thought was sealed has been open for a while now, and you've been breathing the outside air without noticing. She got a call in May about a longer-term housing situation. I was not in the room, but I knew from the way she came out of her bedroom afterward, slower than usual, that the call had contained something she was weighing. She sat at the kitchen table with her phone face down in front of her. I was there. I waited. A friend in Oakland has a room, she said. She's been asking since January. I looked at the table, then at Hare. What did you tell her? That I'd think about it. I nodded. She said, I'm telling you because I think you should know, not because I've decided. I know. I don't know what I'm deciding. That's okay, I said. And then, because I'd decided to stop managing the temperature so carefully, I'd rather you stayed. That's not pressure. It's just I want you to know that's where I am. She looked at me for a moment. The look she gets when she's running a translation, making sure the meaning carries across without losing anything in the conversion. "Okay," she said. "Okay," I said. She didn't call Oakland back that day. I did not ask whether she had. Some questions you don't need to ask when you're paying attention to the right things. May became June. The summer in Pittsburgh arrives with a kind of relief after the long winter, and then becomes its own problem, humid and heavy, and the kind of heat that gets into old buildings and makes them work. My work shifts in summer from heating systems to cooling systems. And there is something I find funny about this in a way I've never managed to explain adequately to anyone who doesn't do what I do. That the skills are completely transferable. Whether you're trying to add heat or remove it, the principle is the same. You're managing the flow of energy. You're ensuring the system can breathe. You're trying to get the space to a temperature where the people inside it can be comfortable without having to think about it. People should be able to be comfortable without having to think about it. That's the whole idea. I serviced our window units in June before the heat came on properly. Both of them, hers and the one in the living room. I cleaned the filters, checked the coolant levels, made sure the drainage was clear. She came to the doorway of her room and watched me work for a moment. "Do you ever get tired of it?" she said. "Maintaining things." "No," I said. And then, because honesty was the operating principle now, sometimes I get tired of maintaining things that aren't worth it. But that's different. She was quiet for a moment. What makes something worth it? I thought about that while I was working. Hands in the unit. Running through the check by feel, the way I do when I know the equipment well. I said, "Whether it gets warm." She didn't say anything, but I felt her still standing in the doorway. "Systems that can hold heat," I said. "That's what you're looking for. Some things you maintain indefinitely, and they stay the same temperature. You keep putting energy in. Nothing changes. Some things, the right materials, the right construction, they start to hold it themselves. You maintain them and they get warmer. That's worth it." I heard her move. When I looked up, she was at the table with her laptop, working. But there was something different in the set of her shoulders. A settling, like a system that had just been told what it was made of. The doorstop is still there. It's a red rubber doorstop with a metal bracket, worn at the wide end, and it sits under her bedroom door from the time she wakes up until the time she goes to sleep. Some mornings it's there when I get up and she's already in the kitchen, which means she opened the door first thing. Before coffee. Before anything. Some mornings it's not there yet and I hear the soft scrape of it going down a few minutes later and I don't mark the time, because I've stopped marking the time. Because some information you stop needing once you understand what it was telling you. What it was telling me. For all those months, was she is learning whether this is a place she can stay in. She is testing the air. She is deciding, one morning at a time, whether to leave the door open or close it, and watching what happens, and gathering the data, and eventually coming to a reading. The reading she came to is this, that a space can be both protected and open, that a door can have a lock and a doorstop, that the need for the exit route doesn't mean you take it. I know this reading because I've been taking my own. I thought, for 2 years, that sealed was the same as safe. I thought that if I kept the temperature controlled, nothing could get in that I hadn't accounted for. What I understand now, what 5 months of paying attention to the wrong variable finally taught me, is that sealed isn't safe. Sealed is just cold. Safety is a system that can regulate itself, that can respond to conditions, that can get warm and stay warm without someone standing at the thermostat managing everything by hand. You have to trust the system. You have to build it right and then let it run. I am learning this. Slowly. The way I learn most things, not from instruction but from watching, from reading the signals, from being in the room long enough to understand what the room is saying. She is patient with my slowness. I am patient with her caution. We are two people who got here from different directions and arrived at the same apartment on Brereton Street in the middle of different winters and are finding, without having planned to, that the thing we were each calibrating toward was maybe always something like this, something like Tuesday evenings in a kitchen with the bridge humming outside. Something like a covered plate and 2 words and a post-it that said, "There's enough." Something like a small red doorstop holding a door open because the person on the other side finally chose to leave it that way. She told me in July that she wasn't going to Oakland. Not dramatically. Not as a declaration. She just said, over coffee on a Saturday morning. I let Marta know I wasn't coming. And I said, "Yeah," and she said, "Yeah." And I said, "You okay?" And she said, "Better than okay." And that was it. That was the whole thing. That was also everything. Later that afternoon, I was on the roof of the building doing some preliminary work on the exterior of a ventilation unit that had been on my list since spring. And I could see the bridge from up there. The full span of it. And the river underneath it. And the North Shore beyond it. And all of Pittsburgh doing its summer Saturday thing in the heat. The city looked like what it is, old and industrial and built by people who needed things to last. And mostly they do. The things people build when they need them to last, mostly do. I thought about what lasts. I thought about what I've been building for the last 7 months without knowing that's what I was doing. I thought about the apartment below me and the woman in it and the doorstop on the floor of the second bedroom and the covered plate on the counter that broke both our rules and was better for it. I thought the heat exchanger on this unit is going to need replacement within the year, and the main seal on the secondary drain is showing early wear, and I should document both of these before I forget. Then I thought I should probably stop eating jarred pasta sauce because she is right that it's fine but it could be better, and I should learn one thing that isn't from a jar. Because there are small ways to be worth staying in a place and that is one of them. I wrote down the equipment notes. I took out my phone and found a recipe for the kind of bean stew she'd made me in February, the one that was warm and meant something, and I bookmarked it. Then I climbed back down the roof ladder and went inside, and she was at the kitchen table, and I said, "What are you doing tonight?" And she looked up and said, "Nothing." "Why?" And I said, "I'm going to make something real for dinner. It might be bad. You've been warned." She looked at me for a moment with that measuring look. Then she said, "I'll set the table." We ate at 6. It wasn't bad. It was, actually, pretty good. The radiators won't knock for another few months. The summer is long in the way Pittsburgh summers are generous and a little slow, insisting on itself. But the building knows winter is coming eventually, the way buildings do. The way systems that have been through enough seasons develop a kind of structural memory for what comes next. It will come. We will be here when it does. The heat, I think, will hold. The duplex on Brereton Street has been standing for 91 years. It has held families through 3 recessions, 2 floods, 1 fire in the building next door that left a scorch mark on the exterior brickwork that you can still see if you know where to look. The pipes have been replaced twice. The electrical was updated in the 90s. The boiler in the basement is a 1987 model that I have kept running through sheer stubbornness and the knowledge that they do not make them that way anymore. I maintain it because things worth keeping require maintenance. Not heroics. Just consistent, attentive care. Showing up. Noticing before it breaks. Adjusting the pressure before the system has to tell you loudly that something is wrong. Nora teaches me things without meaning to. The way she listens without interrupting. Without planning her response. While I'm still talking reminds me that I sometimes fill silence that doesn't need filling. That I reach for a technical explanation when something simpler is more true. She has the professional discipline of someone whose entire job is precision of meaning. And it has made her almost painfully exact with her own words when they matter. When she says something is fine, it is fine. When she says something is enough, she has thought about whether it is. When she said there's enough on a post-it in February and left it on the counter with a covered plate, she was making a statement she had weighed. I am learning to make statements I have weighed. She teaches me this not by instruction but by example, which is the only way anything real is ever taught. There is a morning early June, before the heat settled in that I keep returning to. I got up before she did, which doesn't happen often but happens sometimes. and I made coffee, and I stood at the kitchen window, and I watched the street wake up. The light was the particular low gold of early morning in early summer, before the day gets complicated. And a woman was walking a dog on the far sidewalk, and a kid on a bicycle was navigating the cracked pavement with the careful attention of someone who knows every bump. Normal morning. Nothing notable. And then I heard the doorstop scrape on her floor, the soft sound of her opening the door, and then her feet on the hardwood. Unhurried. And then she appeared in the kitchen doorway in a sweatshirt that was too big for her. Hair not done. Face not arranged for anyone. And she said, "You made coffee." Not as a question. Just a noticing. "Yeah," I said. She poured a cup. She stood next to me at the window. We watched the street for a while without talking. And the dog went by. And the kid came back around on the bicycle, having completed whatever circuit he was running. And the light shifted a degree or two as the sun came up a little higher. "Nice morning," she said. "Yeah," I said. That was all. We drank our coffee. Eventually, she went back to her room and I sat at the table and started looking at my schedule for the day. But I noticed, afterward, the quality of what had just happened. The normalcy of it. The ease. The fact that neither of us had performed anything, had not been careful with each other, had not managed the interaction. He had just stood at a window in the early morning like two people who had nowhere to be yet and were grateful for that. That's what I mean when I say inhabited. That's the temperature I'd forgotten a space could reach. I had built a good sealed system and lived in it alone for 2 years and called it precision. What it was practice for this, for knowing, when something actually worth inhabiting arrived. What I was looking at, for having enough calibration to recognize a good reading when I saw one. Some things you only understand by having done the maintenance long enough.